I have a question for you. What is the murder clearance rate in Chicago? We've heard the stories about how much violence, how many murders are happening in Chicago. How many of those murders have been solved? Do you know? Let's talk about it. Welcome to Escaping the Echo Chamber. Chicago, Chicago, Chicago. If you've ever heard of conservatives, if you've heard them speak, they love talking about Chicago. And as even Tariq Nasheed had mentioned in an interview with academics, Chicago is actually code for black people. And it actually is. Let me tell you how you know. Just the other day, like I think it was Friday or something, Fresh and Fit came out with a video and they're talking about black crime, black people committing the most crime. And I believe they mentioned Chicago as one of the evidences. But even if they didn't mention Chicago, I do a video about Fresh and Fit, and somebody in my comment section says, oh, well, we know black people commit more crime than white people because of Chicago. Interesting. That is very interesting, and it backs up what Tariq Nasheed is talking about. Because when they talk about Chicago, they're not talking about crime. They're just talking about black people. Because they're assuming all of the crime happening in Chicago is committed by black people. There's no Hispanic people in Chicago, apparently. There's no Asian people in Chicago. There's no white people in Chicago. There's only black people in Chicago. So all of the crime happening in Chicago has to be black people. That's the story that they're going with. That's the inference that they're going with. And that's the evidence that what they're using Chicago for is actually a code word, a buzzword. Chicago is code for black people. Now, 90% of the people who are talking about Chicago, 95% of the people who are talking about Chicago have never been in Chicago, have never set foot in Chicago. Yet they're going to tell you who is committing the crime in Chicago, despite the fact that the police can't tell you the same thing. Let me explain. In fact, I'll tell you a story. At some years ago, I was the chairman of the Manhattan Libertarian Party. As the chairman, I would run meetings, and one night before the meeting starts, some new people come in. So as new people come in, I chat them up. Hey, how you doing? How did you find out about us? You know, what brings you, what's your political outlook, and what are you interested in? And so this young couple comes in, and they're like, hey, yeah, we're not really, we found that there's libertarians around, and so we wanted to check you out and learn more and, you know, connect with like minds. I was like, oh, that's great to hear. And they start talking about how they've, you know, listened to right-leaning pundits and people like Ben Shapiro, and they're like, you know, it's common sense because New York is just so left-leaning, it actually frustrates them having to deal with leftists all the time. And so we're talking, and along the way, they start talking about, you know, Chicago and stuff like that. And I say, interesting. So they're talking about Ben Shapiro, and, you know, his take on race relations is so refreshing and enlightening. And they're like, you know, because people will complain about, you know, why black people are more incarcerated, and it's because they're committing more crimes. I'm saying, And I said, well, are we sure about that? And they're like, well, yeah, like, look at Chicago. You've got so much crime happening, and, you know, there's so much black on black crime and murders. It's out of control. I said, but how do we know it's black on black crime? They're like, well, of course we know. I said, what's the murder clearance rate? I says, have you looked into that at all? They're like, well, no. Oh, you haven't looked into the murder clearance rate. So Ben Shapiro says the crime in Chicago is black people, and you've just accepted that as true. Well, they're like, well, I mean, who else is it going to be? I said, who else is going to be? I said, it could be anybody. I'm like, how do we, I'm like, you're saying that we don't know who did it, but it's got to be a black guy? It's got to be black people committing these crimes. This is what you're going with. I said, listen, you're fans of Ben Shapiro, so you may feel that it's black people, but remember, the facts don't care about your feelings. I says, the murder clearance rate in Chicago at the time was like under 30%. At the time, the murder clearance rate was under 30%. So that means over 70% of crimes, of murders, they didn't even know who the perpetrators were. Over 70%. I hit them with that number. I watched their jaws drop. I watched the color leave their faces, what color there was. And That was the last time they ever came to a Manhattan Libertarian Party meeting, at least while I was there. But I tell that story because do you know what the murder clearance rate is in 2021? The murder clearance rate in 2021 is 51%. Wow, 51%. Whoo! Of course, what they're not telling you about that number is the murder clearance rate in 2021 isn't of cases from 2021. So there's a bunch of cases that were solved in 2021 that are from decades ago. The murder clearance rate in 2021 of cases in 2021, I think is like 35%. That's the difference. Not to mention that all of these crimes are not being committed by Black people. But that's the story they're going with. This is the narrative they're pushing and what they're using to create this image of Black on Black crime and Black crime being ubiquitous. Because they're not talking about any other type of crime. They're not talking about Asian on Asian crime. They're not talking about Spanish on Spanish crime. They're definitely not talking about white on white crime. They're not talking about it. They will talk about crime and just provide the inference. In fact, the only one that actually exists, none of those others actually terms are frequently used. The only term frequently used is Black on Black crime. Why is that? Things that make you go, But aside from the murder clearance rate being so horrible, guess what recently came out of Chicago? A story about a detective who had framed 51 people. A detective who is accused of framing 51 people for murder. Seven of his cases have already been reversed and the people have been released. 51 people for murder. But these are things that they won't talk about when they're talking about Chicago. They won't talk about the history of Chicago, of questionable arrest, convictions, of questionable evidence, even when other states and other cities, other big cities, were dealing with police corruption and at least trying to provide an appearance of trying to stamp out police corruption. Chicago was business as usual. They won't talk about that. But these people on the right will claim that Trump is a victim. They will claim that Trump is being persecuted by the FBI. They will claim that the FBI can't be trusted, but they won't say jack shit about the Chicago Police Department. They won't say jack shit about the Baltimore Police Department. They won't say jack shit about the LA Police Department. They won't say jack shit about the New York Police Department. There have been numerous stories and examples and evidences of cultures of corruption throughout all of these police departments. And we're not hearing a peep from people that will use cherry-picked data and statistics to paint this picture of evil Black people, of unruly Black people, of violent and savage Black people. But when you start providing facts and data, people start disappearing. Then people don't want to talk to you anymore. Then people suddenly have something else to do. It's funny how that works out. As always, don't forget to hit the thumbs up, like, share, subscribe if you have not subscribed already. But if you disagree, go ahead and give me a thumbs down. If you think that, no, I know that in Chicago, this is Black people committing all these murders because I went to Chicago 20 years ago and had a slice of deep dish pizza. So I know who's committing the crime. Go ahead and write that down in the comment section so we can all laugh at you. And if you'd like to see another video on this topic, you can click right here, and I'll see you next time.